Hello everyone, here comes another video tutorial, and this one it's on production possibilities frontier. It's a very important model that we're going to learn about today, and it will help us in the future in this class, especially when we'll talk about specialization and trade. And on its own, it actually helps us understand some major concepts of economics. And well, first we need to get like a definition of production possibility frontier, and I got this from our book, and as you can see it says that production possibility frontier is the boundary between the combinations of goods and services that can be produced and the combinations that cannot be produced, given the available factors of production and the state of technology. So what it means is that we assume that we have some factors or some inputs, factors of production, so whatever can be used to make stuff. Like, for example, to grow agricultural stuff, to produce agricultural stuff, you probably will need land at the very least, right? And some fertilizers and some labor time allocated to this activity, and also some technologies. You need to know how to do things, right? And actually, as you probably noticed, as time passes by, people learn to do things better and better. So we have this technological progress. But production possibility frontier, at least in the beginning, the way we're going to use it, we're going to assume that those factors are fixed, as it says in definition, given the available factors of production. So given meaning that there's a certain amount and it's given, not changing, at least for now. And then we can analyze, the boundary between, again, the combinations of goods and services that can be produced and the combinations, again, of goods and services that cannot be produced. Let's see. So what this model gonna do? It actually going to illustrate a few things. I mean, we'll get back to the definition, of course, when getting more into it. But to understand what it's all about, for starters, we need to look at this slide. And in fact, it all comes from the book. In fact, I meant to take a look at the book, but actually I got carried away by my own slides. Well, they're not necessarily all mine, but I just got kind of excerpts from the book, and now trying to make more sense out of it for you. So next slide we're looking at is about how the PPF illustrates scarcity and its consequences. Remember earlier in this class, actually in the very beginning, we talked about scarcity, and hopefully you recall that scarcity is basically about our wants exceeding the amount of resources we have to satisfy those wants, and that makes us make choices. So because we cannot have everything we want, we have to choose. You cannot have everything together, so if you basically you need to choose. And economics is mostly about choices. Again, as you should recall from our discussion of what economics is about. And so PPF illustrates scarcity and some of its consequences by putting three distinctions in a sharp focus. So that would be distinctions between attainable and unattainable combinations or bundles. I can actually use the term bundles now and then, but it's the same as combinations. Efficient and inefficient production, and trade-offs and free lunches. So actually, you know what, let's go back and look in the book, because I create these tutorials to help you out, but actually it cannot replace you reading the book. So I would recommend you, after watching this tutorial, getting like a general idea and getting to the book, which you should have by now, one way or the other. and just look read through it. And after listening to my explanation, that should make more sense. But again, it's a very good idea to read the book and get better understanding what's going on here. So let's just browse through it and then get back to our slides and talk about all these issues. So here's a section on production possibilities. We just saw this definition. It's a very nice, good explanation with some examples here. Some graphs, again, with good examples. Then it discusses attainable and unattainable combinations, so bundles. Then it moves to production efficiency, which we're about to discuss, well, when we get back to my slides. So it's efficient and inefficient versus inefficient production. Again, some graphs to explain the concept. Then the book talks about trade-offs, and that's a big part of the story here. Again, figure that illustrates these concepts, and some examples, good examples here, and then some checkpoints. You can actually use some of them to make sure you understand what's going on here. And then it moves to opportunity cost. So opportunity cost is basically about trade-offs, right? Society is dealing with, or actually individuals as well. This model applies at many levels. So opportunity cost, and how we can use production possibility frontier to illustrate this concept, the concept of opportunity cost. And there are some key observations here. One is that opportunity cost basically is equivalent to the slope of the PPF in the area we're kind of considering those changes in production. And also opportunity cost is a ratio. So we'll get to these things in more detail. I just wanted to give you, again, like an overview. So this graph just illustrates the concept of increasing opportunity cost. In fact, in my own discussion, I think it's a good idea to also consider a case of so-called constant opportunity cost. But we also want to understand the case of increasing opportunity cost, because that's what we're likely to find around us. So we can start like with a case of constant opportunity cost to make things easier, but then move on to this case of increasing opportunity cost. And finally, we're going to talk about economic growth, which basically the case when resources that are available to us increase. And that, let's see, I'm not sure on the proper page. Okay, here it is, economic growth. So by definition, here's the definition. Again, we'll talk about it when we get back to my slides. But basically, economic growth occurs when resources, well, either get increases in resources or we have improvements in technologies. So either way, we are able to produce more without actually sacrificing something. Because if resources are fixed, then there is no way to produce more of one thing without sacrificing or giving up on producing another thing. And that brings us to the concept of opportunity cost. But here, as this economic growth occurs, we observing actually shifts or tilts in the PPF curve itself. So before we would consider just moving along the curve and pretty much making sense out of those moves. Here, the curve itself is tilting out. And well, again, that represents the case of economic growth. And very important case of that growth, it's when society or maybe individuals face a choice between allocating their resources to production of consumption goods versus allocating their resources to producing capital goods. And well, depending on this choice and proportions, they achieve actually maybe even faster economic growth. So by sacrificing consumption today, they can enjoy higher standards of living and higher consumption rates in the future. Okay, so that's a quick review of the book, and I think this is the last page in this chapter. Yes, it is. So now we can go back to my slides and get into more details. Well, I'll try to keep an eye on the clock. So I've been talking for 10 minutes, and I'll try my best not to exceed, I know, probably 30 minutes. All right, so we're back to our slides here, and we already defined or looked at production possibility frontier definition. So again, it's the boundary that separates those combinations or bundles of goods and services that can be produced from those combinations that cannot be produced, again, given the certain amount of factors of production and the state of technology. Okay, and so now we're going to explore these three concepts based on this model. So we're going to see attainable and unattainable combinations, efficient and inefficient production, and also trade-offs and free lunches. So talking about production efficiency, what can we see here? Well, by definition, production efficiency is a situation in which the economy is getting all that it can, all that it can from its resources and cannot produce more of one good or service without producing less of something else. That's actually I mentioned at some point earlier. So basically, when you're achieving the point of efficiency, it means you're already doing as good as possible. You don't have any slack, because if you do have slack, then it means you're not being efficient. And if you're being efficient, it means that you're really pushing like the boundaries of your production possibilities, and that means that if you want to produce more one thing, well, that requires resources being taken from producing something else. And that actually brings us to the trade-off. So trade-off, it's basically an exchange that occurs when we're giving up on one thing to get something else. Well, sounds actually very similar to the concept of opportunity cost, right? And here it is. So as you recall from our earlier discussion, as we talked about some basic concepts in economics, opportunity cost is the best thing you must give up to get it. As simple as that. So opportunity cost is what you're going to give up to get whatever you're getting. And to understand this concept, we actually need to consider some adjustments, right, movements in our production process. So if you look at the PPF, you won't be able to make sense out of it unless you consider certain adjustments here. Okay, so opportunity cost also is a ratio, and opportunity cost in fact connects to the slope of the PPF. Looks like it's time to actually introduce some graphs here to make more sense out of this discussion. So I have, I guess, some spare room here, so let's draw a diagram. And unlike in the book, unlike in the textbook, I'm going to start with a simplified version of the production possibility frontier. So let's make it a straight line so we don't have to worry about all these curvatures on the graph we're seeing in the book. But we'll get there. But first I want you to get some major points about the story here. So let's say we have two goods, X and Y. And that's actually the way the diagram works here. So what we're doing here, we're putting two goods on this axis. So this output of good X, this is output of good Y. So the first thing is to understand, which actually could be challenging for some people, because when they think about economics, they think about inputs and outputs, about production, right? So you might think that, okay, that probably is our input, right? And then this is our output. We use certain things, right, to produce something else, but that's not the way this diagram works. Again, we're talking about PPF here. So what's going on here? Again, remember, we're talking about plotting combinations of good, and here we have to actually, well, goods and services, but here we have to be specific, and we're just narrowing it down to two goods. So we're talking about two outputs, X and Y. And on this diagram, we're going to separate by this PPF, and that's what this line does, which is basically its production possibility frontier. It separates those combinations of these two goods, X and Y, that can be produced and those that cannot be produced. And we are not seeing any resources here. Let me also put 0 here. That actually will be the only number for now we're seeing here. Other than that, it will be just general discussion of values without referring to numbers. So remember, we're assuming that there is certain amount of resources, given amount of resources behind this diagram, and also certain level of technology that can be used here and should be used here when converting those resources into these goods. So it's all given. We're not going to get into details how these resources are being converted into these goods, but what we want to understand is actually eventually the trade-off between like increasing production of one good, let's say good X, and the amount of good Y that we're producing. Basically, we're going to see that to produce more of this good, we need to reduce our production of good Y, because there is no other way to do otherwise. Given that we're being efficient, and we definitely want to be efficient, because if we're not that, it means we're kind of wasting our resources. All right, so back to the diagram. Again, simply put, the meaning of this line, which is our production possibility frontier, is to separate. Its role is to separate those combinations of these two goods that can be produced and which lie down this curve, well, including itself. So whatever lies on the curve or the line and below it is attainable. So that's what our resources and technology allows us to produce. So let me maybe shade it here. So whatever combination we pick here well, let's not crowd this graph too much. So whatever combination of these two goods we pick below this diagram, let's say like this point, by definition, it's attainable. And well, that makes sense, because the closer we are to 0, right, the less of both goods is being produced. So if you if you pick this point, right, this is where you're not producing anything. So if you happen to be here, it means like your resources and technology are not being used at all. You're just sitting there and wasting your resources. But of course, in life, we like, stuff. So given that these goods have some value to us, we want more of those. And that means that any point that is further out, and just notice that at any given point, as you're going further up, right, you're in fact increasing your production of good Y. So starting from whatever point, again, if you just start from 0, let's say you go up, just straight without going not going right at all. So yeah, let's consider this. So let's see, given this PPF, where is our boundary? Well, our boundary is basically where the line is. So if you just consider producing only good Y, which is a possibility, right, then you can go all the way up to this point, and that will be your boundary and limit when producing good Y. Okay, you don't want to stop any lower than this point, right? Because that would mean that you are wasting your resources. You're wasting an opportunity to produce extra good y. Again, assuming that you are focusing on producing good y, and that's it. Same logic applies for good x. If you start at 0, then and want to produce good x and good x only, then you have a choice to go all the way to this point on your PPF. And this is where you want to stop, because, well, you cannot go beyond it, right? Because that's the meaning of PPF. It tells you that, well, anything above it is attainable. So anything below it, did I say attainable? Everything above is unattainable, right? This is unattainable, and this is attainable. There are different words to describe the situation. You can say feasible, or available, or whatever. But attainable, unattainable is the terms we're gonna use here. So again, if you want to produce good x and good x only, then you want to go all the way to this point and stop here, because, well, moving further right is not possible, because these combinations are not attainable. Okay, and like dropping below and staying, actually not below, but staying closer to 0 doesn't make sense, because this way you're wasting, to be exact, your resources, as you're not converting them into goods, while you can, even though you can. All right, so that's like the simplified case. Again, when you're just choose to produce only one good. So you can go either all the way here to this point, or all the way here to this point, or you can choose various combinations. I mean, you can consider going up to this point and producing actually this amount of good x. I hope you guys understand how these diagrams work. So like if you pick this point on the diagram, this distance will kind of indicate the amount of good y you're producing. In fact, like if we wanted to put numbers here, we could. So let's say 1, 2, 3, and so on and so forth. So you would just look up the number, and that number will tell you the amount of good y. But I don't want to mess with the numbers. I just hope you guys can visualize it. And at this point, being in college, you should be able to do that. So this distance pretty much is proportional to the amount of good y that we're producing when being at this point. And let's say you decided to stop here and consider producing some of good x. Well, how much of good x can be produced? Well, you can figure it out just by going to the right, extending a line to the right, and hitting your PPF so that you stop here, because given this amount, let me actually draw it. So again, let's say you decided to produce, I don't know, y, and let's call it ya. And then you decided to actually get some good x given this amount of good y. So you felt like, okay, this is enough of good y. Let's see how much of good x I can make. And you just go to the right, hit your curve, and let's call this point A, in fact. And this distance basically is proportional to the amount of good x that you can produce under the circumstances. But technically, what you should do to figure out the amount of good x that you can produce here is to go down, hit your horizontal line axis, and then measure this distance. So if we had numbers on the horizontal axis, we would have just read the number, but we're not having it, so we're just gonna put this XA here to indicate that this point, in fact, is proportional, well, not the point itself, but actually the distance between 0, right, and the point we just picked is proportional to the amount of good x that we are producing. All right, so I guess to be exact, so it should be not the point. I shouldn't refer to the point. I should refer to distance. So let's say, to make it more kind of exact for you guys, so let's actually count this grids. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So it looks like 8. So 8 units of good X in this case, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 units of good Y. All right, so this is how things work here. And that's just one example how you can figure out your limits of production, or basically production possibility frontier, or production possibility limits. All right, so, and that works, I mean, it works for all possible combinations of those two goods given this production possibility frontier. So if we're producing 6 units of good Y, then it means you can produce up to 8 units of good X. If you want to, actually, if you decide to produce more of good Y, right, then you won't be able to produce 8 units anymore. Let's say you go, well, let's say you want to go to 7, 8, 9 units of good Y. And that means that you won't be able to produce 8 units of good X anymore. Would be nice if you could, but no, you can't. So now let's see how much you actually can produce in terms of good X. So for that, you need to go down from this point, and that would be like the amount you're gonna get, and you actually here can count it, 1, 2, 3, 4, right? So 4 will be XB, and let's call this point B. So that would be YB, amount of good Y at point B, which is 9 here, and amount of good B in this, oh sorry, amount of good X will be 4. And actually let's write down those numbers against those points. So as always, good X shows up first, so we're writing down 4 and 9, and here we're writing down 8 and 6. Okay, so that's just an example of how 2 points can be figured out here. Well, okay, it's been 27 minutes, but oh well, I mean, it takes whatever time it takes to explain it, so I guess I'll just keep going. All right, so now we got 2 points, and we can kind of use them to explain other things here. But before we get there, remember we actually wanted to understand something about efficiency. Yeah, production efficiency right here. So again, it's a situation in which the economy is getting all that it can from its resources and cannot produce more of one good or service without producing less of something else. Simply put, speaking of this diagram, the points that are efficient here are those points that lie on the production possibility frontier itself. So if you think about other combinations, well, these combinations just are not feasible, right? They're unfeasible, so it doesn't even make sense to talk about them because you just cannot get there. You just don't have enough resources to get there, to get that far from getting nothing, right? So again, ideally, you want to get as far as possible from zero, because more is always better, at least I guess in economics, or at least that's what we're going to assume for now. So yeah, this is out of question. Well, all these points, let me do it this way, right? They're feasible, of course. So, I mean, given this is your boundary, right? Production possibility frontier or production possibility boundary, you can again make anything that lies below the curve. But those points will not be efficient. They will be inefficient. Well, why? Because whatever point you pick that lies below your production possibility frontier is not actually utilizing all your resources clearly, right? Because let's say you pick this point, well, and you know that you can do better. You can do better by either going all the way up and pretty much increasing your production of good Y by that much, or you can go from this point to the right and add all this amount of good X to your production, or you can actually consider some sort of combination and like move here or here, wherever, right, and increase both production of good X and good Y. So, and that works for every point that lies below your PPF. Only when you're sitting on the PPF itself, you cannot really increase your production of one good without sacrificing production of another good, and that's actually the case of production efficiency. All right, so that pretty much limits our discussion just to the PPF itself, production possibility frontier, because we cannot go beyond it, above it, and we don't want to go below it. So we just always want to be here on the curve itself. Well, today we're not going to figure out, and actually next time we're also not going to figure out which point is the best. For that we need to introduce preferences, but we need to understand, you know, how our production possibility works. So what choices do we have, and what kind of trade-offs we should be we're going to face and we're going to deal with. And so that brings us to our next step. So remember, trade-off. What are we talking about here? Like when we picked like an inefficient point, right? There was no trade-off. If you like wanted to increase the output of good S, you could do X, you could do that, right? You could gain all this additional unit without sacrificing anything. You would be just pretty much using your resources more efficiently, but you won't have to sacrifice any of good Y to increase your output of good X. But if you are being efficient and already getting everything you can out of your resources, which means being on the PPF itself, then you cannot increase output of one good without decreasing the output of another one. So for example, think about being right at this point. Let's consider these 2 points, A and B. And let's say we start with point B. So let's say you were sitting at point B producing 9 units of good Y and 4 units of good B, and feeling fine for a while. But then you felt like maybe increasing your output for good X. Well, could you just do that? Well, the answer is no, because you're already sitting on your PPF, right? You're being efficient. There is no slack you can use. So there is no way to go like farther right without actually moving down. So the only way to go farther right is to actually move down the curve. So, and let's say you want to go all the way to point A while increasing the output of good X from 4 to 8, right? So you will be able to increase your output of good X but 4 units, which is 8 minus 4, so it's also 4. So actually we can write it down. So sorry, not from A but from B to A. We go from B to A, and that increases our output. And what it does, it increases our output of good X from XB, right, to XA, which means going from 4. So excuse me rewriting it. So it means going from again 4 to 8, and increasing your output of good X by 4. So another way to put it is to say that we're increasing our output from 4 to 8, and so the difference is 4, and that's our increase in good X in this case. All right, so we increase the output of good X, but the question is, what is the cost of this increase? And well, as we only have two goods here, things are pretty straightforward. By going from this point to this point, which means moving further right, we have to go down. And by how much down do we go? Well, we go from that much of good Y to that much of good Y, right? So we're losing, we have to lose or sacrifice or give up that much of good Y to achieve actually this increase in good X. So, well, what is our decrease or drop in the amount of good Y we're able to produce as making this adjustment? Well, change in Y is the difference between what we had in the beginning, which is 9. So Y actually B minus YA. So it's 9 minus 6. So that's 3 units lost in the production of good Y to achieve this increase in good in production of good X. So this is our gain. Maybe I'll use different colors. So this is gain in producing good X, and this is loss in producing good Y. Okay, and well, that illustrates this concept of opportunity cost or trade-off. So we're giving up one thing to get more of something else. And in this case, again, we're increasing production of good X, and we're losing, sacrificing production of good Y. So trade-off here is 3 units of good Y lost to gain 4 units of good X. And so basically in this case, 3 units of good Y is the opportunity cost of 4 extra units of good X. So let's actually write it down. So opportunity cost of good X in this case is 3 units of good Y, right? Well, actually, let me give you a formula right away. So as we go from point A to point B, we're actually gaining good X, and if we want to figure out the opportunity cost of it, we need to divide loss in Y by gain or increase in X. Okay, so and actually we're dividing, it's a ratio, as in fact we saw earlier. So it's going to be 3 over 4, so at 3/4 or 0.75 units of good Y per 1 unit of good X. Okay, so that's the trade-off we're dealing with. And in fact, yep, that brings us, remember, if you go back to the book, this is discussed in this section called opportunity cost is a ratio. So when the ratio we're talking about is the one I just explained to you. That's what that's kind of ratio we're talking about. Very good. Now let's see what else we have here. So another thing we need to figure out is how opportunity cost relates to the slope of the PPF. And well, you just need to recall that slope is rise or drop, if we're talking about like downward sloping curve, like in this case, over run. So in this case, it will be drop or negative rise over run. So in fact, that observation works only when talking about the opportunity cost of the good on the horizontal axis. So for the good on the horizontal axis, basically you can just judge the opportunity cost of it by looking at the slope. So the flatter the curve, the smaller the opportunity cost, the steeper the curve, the higher the opportunity cost. So we can draw it real quick. And again, if it's a kind of simple case of straight PPF, then the steeper the curve, the higher the opportunity cost. So for example, if you have like a shallow curve, relatively flat one, and relatively steep, then you can see that to achieve the same gain in good X, you will need to sacrifice more in case of steeper PPF. So let's say we have PPF 1 and PPF 2. So as you can see, in either case, we're increasing the output of good X. So that's change in X. I use this notation. Delta is for change. I mean, or maybe we can just say gain. Let's say gain in X. Or maybe use this arrow to indicate that we're increasing the output of X. So if we are dealing with PPF1, which is steep, right? Then how can we see the sacrifice in the amount of good Y? Well, we just, again, do what we did earlier. We just see how we move between this point, right? Because that's how much of good Y you could produce being on this PPF and producing this amount of good X. And then as you're moving further right, you're actually moving down the curve. And that brings you to this amount of good Y in this new point. So let's call it A and B, A and B. And this is your drop in the amount of good Y, so decrease in good Y. Let me get rid of this. So you're losing Y, and you see you're losing quite a bit, quite a noticeable amount. Let's see how much would you lose if you were on PPF2, which is flatter. Well, you're going to move from this amount of good Y to this amount of good Y for exactly the same increase in good X. You see, we're just making the same adjustment in the amount of good X. So we're moving down the curve, but our sacrifice is noticeably smaller. So drop in the amount of good Y in this case is smaller because the slope of the curve is flatter. The slope is smaller, so the flatter the curve, the less we're losing as a trade-off when increasing the output of the good on the horizontal axis. All right, so that's the thing about connecting opportunity cost. Well, actually, yeah, we need to look here. So connecting opportunity cost to the slope of the curve of the PPF curve. All right, so let's see. It's been 43 minutes now. I think we made pretty good progress. And I mean, I promised to be done in 30 minutes, but I guess I was over-optimistic. All right, so we have a few more things. I think I already covered quite a bit of important stuff here. Again, don't forget that you have the book to go back and actually now read it with better understanding what it's talking about. Now, actually, let's talk about this increasing opportunity cost situation. So, in fact, now we're gonna look at the PPF diagram that looks more like the one you find in the book. So instead of having a nice straight line, what you're seeing in the book is this kind of curve. So again, this is 0, this is amount of good X, this is amount of good Y, and the idea is still the same. These points are non-feasible, unfeasible, these points are feasible by inefficient, so that actually brings us to this PPF curve. So everything that's going on here is supposed to happen on the PPF, along the PPF curve itself. And generally speaking, everything pretty much works the same way, with some exception. And what is the same is the slope of this curve is still negative, right? So as you're moving from one point to another on this diagram, you're still gonna go down to move further right. So if you go, let's say, from point A to point B, you will increase your output of good X from this amount, right? Again, remember this distance or whatever number you get here tells you how much you were producing of good X you were producing at good at point A. And as you go into point B, you are increasing your output of good B. So this is XB, this is XA. And let me actually make this line a bit thinner. Okay, so you're increasing your output of good X by going from this point to this point. But, well, as you must stay on the PPF curve, right? It means that you will be also moving down. And as you're moving down, you're actually going to lose output of good Y from whatever you had here. Probably I should make it a bit. So you see, like, because the curve is really flat on this side at the upper part, there is almost no loss in the amount of good Y. So you see, if I actually was moving, let me finish it. So this is YB. But if I was moving from this point to this point, you see the loss will be almost like zero. But as you're actually moving further right along the curve, what's happening is that you're losing more than, well, you're actually also making a bigger leap in terms of amount of good X. But yeah, let's focus on point A and B. So the loss is fairly small, right? For the amount you're gaining in terms of good X, you're losing, well, not that much in terms of good Y. And that's what's happening between points A and B, as you're staying on the upper and flatter section of your demand, not demand, of course, but PPF curve. Now let's see what will happen if you were actually moving between 2 points that lie on the steeper section of your PPF curve. Let's say you're still increasing your output by 3 units, going from point A, B, C, D. So that would be X, C, that would be X, not B, but D. So that would be C, D. And we can now measure the amount of good Y we're going to sacrifice. So opportunity cost of this gain in the amount of good X by going from YC to YD. And again, remember that this distance is the amount of good D you have when being at point D. This distance, or whatever number you can read here, is the amount of good Y you have when being at point C. So your loss in this case is that much. So you see, like, but I kept the increase in good X exactly the same. So let's say this is just 1 grid means one unit. So this is your increase in good X as you're going from A to B, and this is increase in good X as you're going from C to D. And well, these are exactly the same, right? But the drop in the amount of good Y is quite different. This is how much you're losing in good Y as you're going from A to B, and this is how much you're losing in good Y when going from C to D. So this loss definitely, well, this loss is definitely larger than this loss. Let me actually maybe use different colors. So this is our loss here, and this is our loss here. Even though, again, increase in the amount of good X is the same in both cases. And well, again, getting back to the idea that you can measure your opportunity cost of good you have on the horizontal axis by pretty much looking at the slope of the line that connects two points between which you're moving. So you see the slope of this section between A and B is quite flatter than the slope of this line that connects C and D. So that makes sense. That rule works. But what else can we, I mean, what can we figure out from this observation, from this example? So we can notice that opportunity cost is not staying the same. Opportunity cost of good X is not staying the same as you moving along the curve, unlike in this case. Remember, like in case of a straight line, well, we didn't really talk much about it, but if we would try to like actually consider a case when moving between two other points, right? Doing the same tricks, like saying C and D. Well, probably you can tell right away because the slope of the curve stays the same, right? It's a straight line. So the slope of this segment is exactly the same as the slope of this segment. So the loss in the amount of good Y when going from point C to point D will be pretty much the same. That would be as much, right? Lost, like just like we lost here. So that loss would be exactly the same. So the opportunity cost of good X per one unit will stay the same no matter which 2 points we're moving between on this production possibility frontier, given that it's a straight line. And that actually gives us the case of constant opportunity cost. So if you're seeing a straight line for your PPF curve, then you should know right away that you're dealing with a constant opportunity cost situation. And here, as you're looking at this curved line, bowed out curve or convex line, then well, you can tell should be able to tell right away that we're talking about increasing opportunity cost situation. And increasing means that as you increasing output of a good that you're gaining, you should be prepared to face like higher and higher opportunity cost of each additional unit of this good. So as X goes up, losses, well, actually opportunity cost of good X is going up as well. That's what we mean by increasing opportunity cost. Very well. Next question is why should we expect this kind of situation? Why should we expect to deal with this increasing opportunity costs? You know, things would be so much easier and simpler if we would have to deal with constant opportunity cost. And if you look in the book, it talks about yes, this increasing opportunity cost are everywhere story. Small segment here. Let me see where it is. So as always, you can go back to the book and read more about it, and not can but should, to be exact. So this small paragraph actually talks about this, but I feel like maybe giving you some more examples here. So we're at 54 minutes now, but I guess whatever time it takes to explain, I'll just do that. And I guess technically our lecture is supposed to be like within 1 hour 15 minutes, so I probably shouldn't feel too bad. I mean, I'm always trying to be quicker, but I think I'd rather be thorough rather than fast. So we have two more things. We want to talk about why we expect those increasing opportunity cost situations. And then we'll talk about economic growth. So I think I'll fit within the I guess standard time limit for our class time, assuming that I'm lecturing in class. So why would we, under what circumstances should we expect this kind of behavior from opportunity cost? Why would we expect, what would be a good example to understand why opportunity cost is going up? And I think, I'll go further than the book goes, and I'll give you an example of using like land to produce agricultural goods. And generally speaking, you can say that we're dealing with increasing opportunity cost because most of the time in real life, resources are not equally suitable for producing whatever products we're making. So basically, that happens because we have to deal with the increasing opportunity cost situation because resources are not like uniform. They are not like exactly the same. Like if you think about land, right? Or even like human resources, people vary like in their skills. So it's not like so if you're gonna add like one extra person to your like plant, well, assuming that you will probably start with people who are the most productive, then you will be running out of those who are, you will get the more productive best people first, right? But then you will be running out of them, and so you will be getting people who are less productive. Same thing with land. You could imagine a situation and not just imagine, just kind of realize that in real life, land is not exactly the same. So there are more fertile land, less fertile land, right? And so that actually results in different opportunity cost. And let me give you like an example with land. So let's say you have like this strip of land, and you can actually split it in different squares. So you have piece 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. And let's say you're considering, basically, you have two types of outputs. Let's say you can do agricultural goods. So agriculture, and you can do like industrial goods. Like you can build like a shop or start building shops on this land. Well, first let's assume that land is completely uniform. So it's absolutely like nice, very uniform strip of land. So all pieces are have exactly the same productivity as others. And well, if this is the case, let's say you start with using all your land to grow agricultural stuff. Okay, so it's all used to produce agricultural stuff, and actually we can even like draw a diagram to illustrate it. So let's say this is our agricultural stuff, and this is our industrial stuff. And so if you put all your resources in producing all this land in producing agricultural stuff, you will produce up to this amount of agricultural goods, right? Now, let's say you wanted to, well, build some shops on your land. And let's say you move in incremental steps. So let's say you want to build like your first shop. And let's say one shop takes exactly one piece of land of that kind. And so let's say you're building your first shop. And again, first we're assuming that land is completely uniform. If this is the case, building land on this, and not land, but building your shop here will take it out of production, right? So it will take out some production of agriculture. So you will gain output in terms of industrial output, right? So you will maybe go here. But it will take away again some output, so you will drop down. So let's say this is your loss in agricultural output. So you gain this industrial output, you lose that much in agricultural output. This is your agricultural output loss, this is your industrial output gain. And assuming that all land is the same, right? All lots are equally productive. So this one, and so on and so forth. So if you just keep going, replacing like your agricultural stuff with shops, what will be happening? every time you take a piece out of your agricultural production, right, you're losing exactly the same amount of agricultural stuff, because again, all lots here are exactly the same, and so you're losing exactly the same output in terms of agricultural production. That will, in this case, you will have a nice straight production possibility frontier, and your opportunity cost will stay constant. All right, so that would be the simple case of constant opportunity cost. Now let's realize that most likely your land is not actually equally productive. And like for simplicity, let's say, I mean, usually it probably will be not as straightforward, but let's say it just this strip, this is the most productive piece, this is the second in productivity, and then just your productivity goes kind of, if you draw like a diagram, it kind of drops down. So this is, let's say this is the graph for productivity. So this is the, again, this is the most productive, and this is second, and this is the least productive. Now, what would happen in this case? Again, if you would try to build the same kind of PPF, you will start with like allocating all your resources to producing good agricultural goods. So this is maximum output. So this is maximum, we can say, output of good A. And then again, you will start like allocating some of these pieces of land to your shops. And so it will give us these points here, right? But if these pieces of land are not equally productive, how would you do it for the first, to build your first shop? Remember, this is the most productive, this is the least productive. Which lot should you use to build your first shop? Well, if you think about it, in being rational, you probably don't want to take the most productive, right? Agriculturally most productive piece of land. You want to actually keep those good pieces for agricultural use as much as possible. So you want to go after the least productive piece of land here. Least productive, again, in terms of agriculture. For industrial output, we assume they're equally good. As long as there is like piece of land, it will be fine to build a shop there. Okay, so you're taking out this piece, right, which is the least productive. What does it mean? It means that your loss in the agricultural output should be fairly small, right? So you will only drop maybe by that much. If I just draw this line, so this distance is our loss in agriculture. Again, because this first or last unit we're taking out is not really that good for growing stuff. So by taking it out, we're not really hurting our agricultural output by very much. Now, let's say we want to build another shop. One is already built, then let's build another one. So that means we're gonna move from this, now from that, or basically from this point and producing that much in terms of industrial output to here. Now let's think how much we're going to lose in terms of agricultural output. And realizing that we already took out the worst piece of land, we need to go for the second worst, right? But the second worst is actually better than the one we just used already, right? So we're actually moving to the next one, which is by definition more productive than the one we took out. So that means that as we're taking out the second piece of land, which is more productive than the one we already took out, we're gonna lose more agricultural output. So you see, like this loss in good Y, not Y, sorry, of course it's good A now, is actually larger than the loss we had here, because we took out the most productive, not the most, but more productive piece of land in comparison to the one we took out the first time. So you see, that's why we actually seeing this kind of increase in slope, which is actually negative, but still the slope it's negative, but it's getting steeper. And that explains why we're actually facing increasing opportunity cost here. You see, because again, land is not equally suitable in this case for producing agricultural stuff, and being rational, we're supposed to start taking out the least productive in terms of agricultural stuff, and that will be hurting us less in the beginning, but as we cutting into more and more productive land, will be hurting our agricultural culture more and more for each additional unit of industrial output. So we should expect that as we move further right on this diagram, we're gonna lose more and more agricultural output for each additional unit of industrial output. And I'm kind of running out here. I probably should have used different slope, but I'm sure you're getting the idea here. Okay, so eventually, let's see, we stop here, which, well, again, I should have probably made those slopes not as steep, so I could have gone like all the way for 7 units here. But again, I think even these two examples already giving you the idea. All right, so that explains why we expect in real life, we expect increasing opportunity cost situation. And now we can move on and talk about economic growth. So the definition we get in the book is that economic growth is the sustained expansion of production possibilities. So basically what's happening here is that either resources that we have increasing, or our technology is improving. And let's do it really quick because we're already over an hour. And basically what happens when we're experiencing economic growth is that, let's say we're talking about this increasing opportunity cost, PPF. So let's say this is PPF1, and growth could look like this, PPF2, or it actually can look like this. Well, maybe I'll draw a separate diagram. Well, maybe not. Let's save time. So let's do it like PPF3. So what's happening with PPF3 as opposed to PPF2 is that in case of PPF2, we have like a proportional increase in the output of both goods, right? And in case of PPF3, we have like more prominent increase in the amount of good X that we're making. And that could happen if we have like increase in the amount of resources that are more suitable for producing good X. In fact, it could be when we're improving technology on producing good X. So like when producing only good X, we can achieve this noticeable increase in good X, right? But you can actually notice that given this improvement, this growth, if we stick to producing only good Y, then we will not even notice this improvement. So to gain from this growth or improvement in technology related to only good X, we need to actually produce some of good X, and actually it will allow us to produce more of good X and good Y, because now opportunity cost of producing good X is getting smaller as we're increasing productivity in producing good X. And again, this case is when apparently we either improving technology in producing both good X and Y, or having growth, economic growth in resources that actually can be used to produce either good. Okay, so and then one special case here is the case when we're actually experiencing trade-off between not just two consumption goods, but actually trade-off between consumption goods and capital goods. What are capital goods? Well, consumption goods are pretty obvious, right? So consumption goods that are being produced for consumption, so we consume them and that's it, they're gone. And by the way, speaking of the book, don't forget that it has all these detailed explanations here. So if you, speaking of economic growth, I believe, yeah, here it is. So make sure you read this section, not that much, but especially this box. So consumption goods versus capital goods. So what the difference goods between those two types of goods? Again, as I explained, consumption goods are being consumed and they're gone. Capital goods actually are goods that can be used for further production. So capital goods are not just being consumed and like eaten, or just that they're not going to be gone. They will be like investments. So like examples of capital goods like machinery, or like trucks, or again something you don't just use to enjoy yourself but to actually make more of other stuff, like computers, for example. If you buy them not to play games but to do some productive work, then spending time of like a computer will actually increase your future productivity, so it could be considered as capital good. And I guess even better example would be like different programs, right? You can buy like spend like $100 buying like a computer game, or you can buy like a program that would allow you to do something productive. And so in case of game, it's just consumption. In case of productive, application that will allow you to do things faster, that would be capital good or investment. Okay. So, and here we're getting we're getting an interesting diagram here. So let's say at certain point, and it actually illustrates like, in fact, economic growth that happens not just because it happened for whatever reason, but you can see how you can control economic growth by allocating resources in a certain way. So let's say you pick this point on your PPF, basically only producing consuming goods. Well, that probably means that your PPF will not go any further, right? But if you put some of your resources into producing capital goods, so let's say this is point A and this is point B. So if you put your resources here, right, so you will have to sacrifice some of your consumption, current consumption. So next production period, you will have to, instead of consuming that much consumption goods, you're only going to consume that much. But in the same time, you will invest in the future. So that will be your investment in the future. And that investment is supposed to actually move your PPF, future PPF, further out. So this is PPF2. Given that you picked point B previously, and in fact the further up you go, again in the initial period, let's say you actually went as far as point C, so you cut even more on your current consumption. So this way you increase your investment into capital good even more. So given that, you should expect even further growth in your future production possibilities. So that would be PPF still 2, but given that you in the initial period, right, you chose this point, in again investing more in the future. So that's the idea of economic growth and how you can actually promote it by investing in the future, cutting on current consumption, and just putting more resources, allocating more resources for making you more productive in the future. And if you do that, then in the future you actually can, well, either consume more. Basically, in the next period, you will be facing the same dilemma. Is it time to stop and just enjoy high level of consumption that you pretty much achieved thanks to your prudence in the initial period, or you might want to say, oh, maybe I'll save even more, maybe I'll just keep pushing my PPF further and further out. And if you think about, you know, economic development, that's what developing countries have been doing. I mean, we've been pushing, investing, and increasing our production possibilities, and we still, if you think about work like crazy. I mean, we could have just relaxed and could have enjoyed like whatever level of consumption like previous generations, like, you know, like century ago. We're consuming way more, but we're not stopping. We still still pushing out. Okay, so looks like I was exactly sharp. It's 1:15. I thought I would do it in 30 minutes. I did it in 1 hour 15 minutes, but again, I guess it's like standard class time, and I'm sure it was helpful, so I hope you guys enjoyed it. Now it's time to go to the textbook and actually polish your understanding of this material. All right, thank you very much. I'll talk to you later.